And Sharice Pham, thank you very much, live in Tokyo.
Yeah, thanks to you both. Well, as the North Korea crisis escalates, the Trump administration taking a confrontational approach towards Pyongyang. But is that the best way to address the tensions?
Let's talk about that with James J. Carafano in Washington. He is the Vice President for Foreign and Defense Policy Studies at the Heritage Foundation. Jim, thank you so much for joining us.
Good to be with you.
So are you concerned at all that this aggressive rhetoric back and forth may lead to a miscalculation?
No, not at all. Look, there's not an escalatory ladder here. I mean, North Korea doesn't want a war because the only reason why they have nuclear weapons is to sustain the regime, and a war would ensure the regime is gone. South Korea doesn't want a war. They take terrible casualties. Japan doesn't want a war. China doesn't want a war. They have to deal with all the refugees. The United States doesn't want a war. Nobody has an incentive to climb that escalatory ladder. So actually, the risks of an inadvertent war or an intentional war, I think, are actually pretty near zero. Now, that doesn't mean there's not a North Korea threat here, because they're continuing to develop a military capability. But we actually have a policy response that addresses that.
So Jim, you know, a lot of people say these are incendiary comments from the U.S. side that we haven't heard before from a U.S. president. Do you think that, you know, the flip side of that might be that it could have an impact on Kim Jong-un, that the president speaking his language in a way might work? Do you think that could be the case?
No, I think it's irrelevant. I mean, one of the real missing things here is that somehow the nature of our rhetoric impacts North Korean behavior. We've got about a good 20 years of history of dealing with this regime when they've been on this nuclear path, and it's very clear that the nature of the rhetoric that's used on the regime has had zero impact on the regime's behavior.
If you say that nobody wants war, if the U.S. doesn't want war, then why draw this red line? President Trump, you know, issuing this threat, basically saying, look, you know, we'll bring war to you, essentially, if you continue to threaten us in this way. So what happens the next time North Korea threatens the U.S., launches another ballistic missile as a test? What then?
So I would say, if you actually parse this apart and look at what is the actually policy underneath this, it's actually the same policy that the United States has really had since the 1940s, is that if you attack the United States, we will respond with overwhelming force, particularly if nuclear weapons are involved. That's been U.S. policy only like forever. And the other thing is Trump is not talking to the North Koreans. Basically, this is a statement to the people who put him in office, which most of his strategic communications are designed for, saying, look, you put me here to protect you. I promise I will protect you. He's reassuring the people that put him there that he is a strong president. He's not talking to the North Koreans.
Well, shouldn't he be talking to the North Koreans when it comes to negotiating, or the prospect of any sort of negotiating? Is it time to say the nuclear horse has bolted? The North Koreans pretty much have what they've been looking for all these years, and it's time to sit down and have a chat about it, talk about containment rather than prevention, because prevention's becoming a moot point.
No, because our strategic interests are, there's not a war in Northeast Asia. There is not the capability to directly threaten the United States. We can achieve all those interests without regime change, without World War III, and without trying to bribe the North Koreans. We can have, between strategic deterrence, missile defense, conventional deterrence, and heavy sanctioning, which disrupts the supply chain and allows them to build up their arsenal. That's a policy that keeps that threat from becoming greater.
Is there a clear North Korea policy from the Trump administration? And, you know, just to illustrate some confusion, you know, some critics are saying there are mixed messages coming out from the Trump administration. You have President Trump and his defense secretary using very aggressive language, you know, even talking about destruction and war, while you have the Secretary of State saying, hey, everyone, calm down. In fact, North Korea, we want to talk to you. We're not your enemy. Everyone can sleep well at night. There was no new threat there. Is there a conflicting message? Is everyone really on the same page? What is the North Korea policy?
Well, I just described what's emerging as the North Korean policy. It is essentially heavy containment. It's missile defense, nuclear deterrence, conventional deterrence, the alliance, military demonstrations, and I think we'll see is increased sanctioning of Chinese entities to disrupt the supply chain. This administration is different than the last administration. The last administration tended to kind of talk lemming-like, where everybody just repeated the president's talking points. In this administration, what they tend to do is have each part of the administration talk to their strengths. So Trump mostly sends messages which are really communicating to his supporters. Tillerson sends the messages to the foreign governments and diplomacy, and Mattis is delivering the military assessments. So these messages really aren't contradictory. They're not breaking with each other. They're emphasizing different messages for different audiences.
And of course, North Korea is listening no matter who the audience is. James J. Carafano, we appreciate you joining us. Thanks for the conversation.
Thanks for having me.